not he who tells. Chapter 1. Fornit Cum Fornis. Everybody knows my name. I have long since reached that position of dubious honor. Everybody, from the critics to my greatest fans, to the lottery jockey who wouldn't recognize one of my books if it chased him 10 blocks and mugged him in a blind alley, they all know my name. Of course, that's due to more than just the books. The movies that were made from them are surely part of the blame for my widespread recognition among those who don't subscribe to Book of the Month Club. Let me admit at the outset, constant reader, with due respect to the filmmakers, that more than a few of those movies weren't exactly Oscar material. A couple of them were out-and-out clinkers. When I watch them, it's like seeing some dearly departed loved one resurrected in zombie form by an impish but powerful force, like Louis Creed's unfortunate son in Pet Sematary. The Walking Dead always look more or less the same as when they dwelt among the living, but there's always a telltale missing element in the eyes. Like George Romero's movie zombies, some of my characters don't get around very well once they hit the big screen. They lurch and gimp, trailing bits of themselves like rancid candies from a broken piñata. Annoyingly enough, I could never quite pin down where the movies got it wrong. At what point did those familiar characters begin to shamble and grunt like zombies, leaving essential character traits and nuance lying around the cinemascape like rotted fingers and toes? Someone once told me that my books didn't translate well to the silver screen because it wasn't the stories that made them great, but the life that was breathed into them by the author. That was a compliment, I'm sure, but it made me feel a little shitty. It made me feel like a wretched parent pimping my gifted children and treating them like monkeys collecting change for the grinder. I won't try to tell you I didn't get a neat thrill every time I saw one of my characters get up and walk and talk on the big screen, but I will tell you it was a numb thrill, like that first whiff of ether at the dentist's office. And just like with the dentist's ether, when the thrill wore off, I usually found a strange empty socket where something else used to be, something that had been a part of me. But I digress. Lately, I've been kicking around the idea of retirement. Now, I don't usually admit this to people. When I do, I always get the same response: theatrical incredulity, followed by hearty, well-meaning denials, half encouragement and half scolding. I suspect that these admonitions, to some extent, are an effort to stroke my pride. The temperamental literary prima donna, people think, has to feed his ego monster somehow. And this, I am only slightly ashamed to admit, is not entirely untrue. But the people who say those things are my friends and family. Deep down, they know that eventually the old story mill may just shut down all by itself, no matter how many books I've sold, or how many reviewers get paid to say the writer is still at the top of his game. When and if that day was to come, most of those people would continue to be exactly what they are now, what friends and family are to any regular kind of guy. But then there are the others, my readers, the members of the official fan club, the people who pay the exorbitant fees to hear me speak at the occasional as possible, literary seminar. I've learned not to talk about retirement with them. On the surface, their response looks about the same as the response I get from my friends and family, but only on the surface. There's something under their unfamiliar but intimate gazes, something in the sheer impersonal force of their anonymous numbers, an undercurrent that reminds me of Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are. You remember that one, don't you? When Max, the little boy in the wolf costume, made to leave their island, the wild things, if you'll pardon the analogy, roared their terrible roars and gnashed their terrible teeth and rolled their terrible eyes and showed their terrible claws, and they cried, "No, no, please don't go. We'll eat you up. We love you so." I know that it isn't a very polite or even fair thing for me to think. Constant Reader has proven very generous and loyal to me in the years since I finished Carrie while hunkered down in a nook between the washer and dryer of a rented trailer. But I think it nonetheless. It's been a few raucous decades since I came to the land of the wild things, since I tamed them with the magic trick of staring into their yellow eyes and not blinking once until they proclaimed me the wildest thing of all. It's been one long wild rumpus. Still, I am beginning to feel that the time may soon come for me to secretly hop back into the boat that got me here and hope it still remembers the way back. Because after all, I'm not really the wildest thing of all. I'm just a little boy in a wolf suit. The trick, just like Max knew, is to get away before the real wild things figure that out. But why? The inner interviewer asks, taking off his glasses in a let's get down to brass tacks manner, and in my mind he always looks like Charlie Rose on PBS. Why stop writing at all? It's fun, isn't it? It's profitable. And really, can you stop? Is it even possible? Good questions, every one. Over the years, many people have pointed out how many of my characters have been writers. From The Shining's Jack Torrance to Tad Beaumont of The Dark Half, to the beleaguered hero of the short story Word Processor of the Gods, one of my personal favorites. Someone recently informed me that at last count, I've written stories about 37 fictitious authors. Frankly, I think that's a bit of a low ball. There's a simple reason for it. The fact is, to me, the act of writing, of watching people and events and worlds scroll spontaneously out of my trusty old keyboard, is one of the most singularly mysterious and inexplicable tricks imaginable. It is absolutely a form of magic. But the difference between the stage magician and the word magician is that the stage magician won't tell you how the trick works. The word magician would tell, is sometimes paid very handsomely to tell, but he simply and honestly doesn't know. I wrote a story once called The Ballad of the Flexible Bullet. It was one of my earlier novellas, and if I'm perfectly blunt, it's a little flabby. The essence of the story, however, still haunts me today as much as it did a few decades back, when it was just a germ of an idea rattling around in my brain. It's about a writer who actively confronts the mystery magic of his typewriter. Baffled by his success and the sheer enigma of fiction, he decides that the actual creative work of writing is in truth accomplished by a tiny magical elf that lives inside his Underwood typewriter. He called the elf a Fornit. In the end, the little boy kills the Fornit, and the writer, driven to the point of insanity, eats a bullet from his own gun. Over the past few decades, I have occasionally lain awake at night wondering how close I had, or would, come to making that story autobiographical. The attendees at those literary seminars I infrequently speak at have asked the dreaded question more times than I can count. You all know the dreaded question, right? Let's ask it together. Where do you get your ideas? My publisher put together a neat little website that answers questions about me for the world, more questions than I am truly comfortable with, but inquiring minds want to know, I guess. And they've devised a tidy answer to that awful, insidious question. Where does the author get his ideas? Very simply, the author has a very active imagination. Ha ha, I told them, that's a good one. But it isn't really an answer. It's just another way of asking the question. The reason I hate the dreaded question so very much is that I simply don't know the answer myself. Like Pharaoh seeking the meanings of his prophetic dreams, I would pay a modern-day Joseph grandly if he could answer that riddle for me. Tad Beaumont in The Dark Half said it was like having an invisible third eye. The third eye sees things that other people can't see, and what it sees, he simply writes down. Perhaps more plainly, writing stories is like being a conduit. The stories, I've learned, want to be written. They want to be channeled through the conduit and onto the paper, where they become real. I think most writers, if they're honest, will tell you the stories surprise you sometimes. They twist and writhe as they reach the paper, like things penned with a live snake dipped in ink. Characters say things you don't expect. Events spin off into directions you hadn't planned. Happy endings invert on you and turn ugly and bitter, and vice versa. And in the end, no matter how much you may try to roll things out the way you'd plotted, fighting the story only makes it weak. Sometimes it kills it altogether. A good writer, fundamentally, is merely the conduit who is settled back and offered as little interference as possible. A good writer lets the story write itself. But the conduit, which starts out sweet and intoxicating, a good trick to impress people with at parties, it grows. It gets fat and bossy. In time, you realize it has mastered you more than you it. Eventually, the story takes over and makes you into its tool. When that happens, the dream machine begins to turn into something a lot closer to plain old work. It becomes the thing that we creative types hate more than anything else in the whole wide world. The very thing we all turned to writing to escape in the first place. The dreaded day job. That fact, more than anything, is what's needled me to consider retirement. To ponder packing up the old word processor and scratchbooks for good. Fornit and all. I was thinking about these things as I drove to a meeting 3 weeks ago. The meeting was with a pair of producers and my agent. The producers were planning a television movie based on a screenplay I had written. The screenplays, I might mention if you'll indulge me, transfer much better to film than do the novels. Probably because they end up being exactly what they started out as. Nothing has to get condensed or summarized or lopped off to fit into a 120-minute time slot. In the end, they may fare no better with the critics or viewers than the book adaptations, but at least they don't leave me feeling like a bastard's father. The meeting was in a little town called Hanford. The producers had chosen the town as the setting for their film, and I, having at least some creative input in things like location and casting, had planned to meet them there to give it a once-over and grant my rather superfluous okie dokie. My agent was flying in to handle the official stuff. I hate the official stuff. That's why I pay him, and he richly deserves it. The trip to Hanford took 3.5 hours by car. I used to fly to appointments like this, even though I hate flying, but those days are pretty much over. Being something of a literary household name, even now, doesn't mean that I have an immediately recognizable face, regardless of how many versions of it have graced, or marred, the backs of any bestsellers. Airports, however, as even the least literate know, are places to bring a book. Concourse newsstands are full of paperbacks of my stuff, being just the sort of apparently meaningless brain candy that I suppose is perfect for a long flight or a long wait between flights. I can still walk in occasional mall and not be stopped by anyone with that crazed look of starstruck recognition. Even perfectly delightful people can look like toothy stalkers when the recognition sets in, I am unhappy to say. But I can't seem to navigate a single airport anymore without at least one person surreptitiously comparing me to the photo on the back of a dust jacket, as if they were verifying a killer against his most wanted poster. So now I drive, and I like it. I stop sometimes and jaw with the attendants when I fuel up. We chew the fat about the weather and the price of premium unleaded and the Patriots' playoffs chances. Small talk is a lost art these days, outside of gas station mechanics and fuel jockeys on the flat stretches of New England's highways. And I've never met a one who recognized me or gave a flying fart if he did. I drive, and I listen to classic rock, the hits of the 70s, 80s, and today, or an audiobook. Sometimes I turn off the stereo and just think. Very often, in the old days, it was in that companionable lull, with the road thrumming dreamily away beneath me, that the story would drop by. "Don't let me get in the way," it would say affably. "I'm just going to set up over here in my usual spot in the corner, tinker a bit, you know." And in the old days, I would let it. I would watch. My wife, when she rode with me, would see it on my face and in the long bouts of silence. Later, she would say, "You were working on a story. I didn't want to interrupt you." And I would smile and nod. It was nice to be known that way. But I wasn't really working on the story. It was more the other way around. As I drove to my meeting, I could feel the conduits opening, fat, more invasive than it used to be. The story tried to come, more confident these days, even a little belligerent, but I stopped it at the door. I didn't tell it I was closed for business. Not yet. I just told it to come back later. I arrived almost 2 hours before my meeting. Leaving early, almost obsessively so, is a habit I've developed over the years. I always allow myself extra time to stop for a burger and a beer, time to browse an interesting junk shop, time to jaw with the gas station Joes. Less serendipitously, but perhaps more probably, while under the influence of the story, I have been known to forget where exactly I'm going. More than once, while engaged in the voyeuristic tinker-toy constructions of other worlds and other lives, I may or may not have driven straight past an important exit. Further, I may or may not have continued merrily on for some miles before even realizing it. Uncharacteristically, none of that had happened on my way to Hanford. As I passed the sign which turned U.S. Highway 24 into the business district of the town, I coasted to a leisurely 35 and checked my watch, musing about what I was going to do for the next few hours. Hanford was an almost absurdly typical small New England town. At its furthest edge, just past the fast food joints and a Red Roof Inn, which always cluster on the outskirts of small towns, like reluctant big city transfers refusing to mingle with the local yokels, there was a Sunoco station, which doubled as a used car lot, followed by a Moose Lodge and an elderly Howard Johnson's motel/restaurant. There was a dutiful-looking IGA and a Rainbow Bowl Away, and a Rusty's Corner barber shop. After a mile or so, the businesses gave way to large, meticulous houses which tucked their crew-cut yards about them like the skirts of old Southern debutantes. I passed a high school with a group of kids playing scratch baseball on the back diamond, then progressed more slowly into a warren of tightly clustered World War II tract houses and enormous overgrown trees, their roots humping the sidewalk up into tented snaggles. Cars lined the road this Sunday afternoon, their owners most likely sequestered away in their living rooms, watching SportsCenter, drinking beer, avoiding yard work. I checked my watch again, reminding myself I had time to kill. Spontaneously, I decided to drive on a bit further, find some nondescript roadside greasy spoon where I could grab some lunch and read the paper, or maybe the book I had brought with me. Hanford began to break apart and trickle past me as I sped up. Then, just at the farthest, wind-burnt edge of the town, a small bar hove into view. It wasn't a particularly welcoming-looking place, just a squat cinder-block box with a few dark windows buzzing neon. The gravel parking lot had half a dozen cars scattered around it. It wasn't the sort of place I'd had in mind. Nonetheless, I found myself angling my navigator over the culvert and into the gravel lot. It was the name of the place that hooked me. It was called the Mellow Tiger. The name was painted in cracked black letters on a rooftop sign outlined in geriatric green neon. The Mellow Tiger is a particularly odd name for a bar. Even odder, it's the name of the bar on the edge of the fictional town of Castle Rock, a place I know all too well, a place I've done a lot of romping in and caused an awful lot of mischief. Hugh Priest, cutting work early from his city job, would spend most of his nights in the old Mellow Tiger, drinking Pabst Blue Ribbon and kicking the jukebox when the Hank Williams records skipped. It was the place where Homer Gamache met his VFW buddies on Wednesday nights for pinochle or poker. It was also the place where Billy Tupper and Henry Beaufort were shot with poison-dipped .45 bullets on the night all of Castle Rock went succinctly to hell, to the tune of a certain Mr. Leland Gaunt's gleeful fiddling. The Mellow Tiger is a weird name for a bar. That's why I made it up, why I tacked it in neon letters to the front of the tiny bar on the square lot at the corner of Route 16 and the old Castle Road. It's a weird enough name to be believable. It's somehow too fictional to be fiction. With a mixture of amusement and pike, I locked the doors of my navigator, pocketed the keys, and headed inside.